Chapter 18. Sig looked sheepish. He had sneaked in the door while I was recovering from my session on the roof. "What are you doing home so early?" I asked. "Mrs. Carter said I couldn't pick anymore." That didn't sound reasonable. Mrs. Carter was picker poor. What was the trouble? "She's tough. She makes you work hard." I defended her. "She has to be tough. She's got a crop to pick." "Yeah, but she lets her own kids get away with murder." "Well, what she does with her own kids is her own business," I said. "What was your problem?" Sig gave me the big-eyed wonder look. "I don't know." I gave him the direct answer look. "Could it be that you were playing around, throwing berries?" The innocence left his eyes. "Guess so." While he sat and suffered, I thought of my course of action. I could give him a spanking and send him back with an apology, and Mrs. Carter would probably put him back to work again. But he was getting too big for spankings. And what if he didn't work out again? That would be imposing on Mrs. Carter. "Sig, I want to explain something to you. It is God's plan that a man works for his living. You're 12 years old, and you're big enough to start." I ordered him to the basement of the barn. Corey had said he was going to hire a bulldozer to scrape it out, but now I decided that Sig could do it, pick and shovel. I left, figuring I had to be a good soldier and to go back to the roof. "He restoreth my soul." I started up the scaffolding, taking giant steps. We were almost to the ridge now. I inspected every shake carefully, fit it carefully, and nailed it carefully. "Let's move our footing up," Corey said, and loosened the footboard we were using. He positioned it and nailed his end in place. I started to nail my end when suddenly it went sailing out from under me, and I was tumbling down the roof. I felt my feet going over first, and I knew I was a goner. I'd make a hole 6 feet deep, and there'd be no use digging me out because I'd just have to be buried again. Then a miracle happened. I was able to catch hold of the original footboard, and then I felt Corey tugging on me. How I got back up and sitting on the edge of the roof was another miracle. Corey was sitting beside me with his arm around me, telling me not to cry, which is what I was doing because my stomach was in 1,000 knots. "Stay right here," Corey said. "I've got to get a ladder and get you down." I watched him start across the roof, more cautious now. He knew my present calm was only temporary. "He maketh me to lay down in green pastures." With the ladder secure, Corey demanded that I take the first step. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every step was torture, but I knew that it was the only way to safety. After I was down, Corey said emphatically, "And you're not going back up anymore." With that, he gathered up some shakes and started back up the ladder. I went back to the house. I was ashamed. Always getting him into things, and not being able to hold up my end of the bargain. Finally, I decided to go down and see how Sig was doing. He was playing with the ducks. I wanted to sit down and play too, but I realized with a pang this was not playtime, and I realized that to keep Sig right at it, I'd have to stick with him. "Sig, it's my obligation to teach you how to work. You may not like me now, but in years to come, you may thank me for it." I found a shovel and dug in. It was more miserable than roofing. The clay was like rock, and Sig and I both learned what it was to keep going even when our muscles were crying out sore. I decided I wasn't cut out to be a peasant. If the revolution came and they figured I wasn't good enough to be in the art group who spent all day playing instruments and painting pictures, they might just as well shoot me. Arlo happened by. "Looks like you're teaching the kid to be a ditch digger." Arlo never tried to conceal the grudge he had against Sig. "Yeah, and if a ditch digger is all he ever gets to be, at least he'll be a good one." 5 days later, Freya came home for lunch. Mrs. Carter really needs more pickers, and she's willing to give Sig another chance. I didn't let on how happy I was. I watched him hop up the road like a jackrabbit. I looked up at the barn. Corey was busy nailing shakes. I felt I should go up and join him, but then I remembered his ultimatum. So I sat down at the piano. As soon as the berry picking was over, it was time for haying. Freya's friend Judy had a sister, Sharon Ming, who was married to the son of the valley's biggest dairyman, Florian Ming. She had made arrangements for him to come and cut our hay. One afternoon we watched a big tractor coming across the valley. I had expected that he would detour around the washout. It had been repaired a couple of times, but every time we had a deluge, it washed out again. Much to my surprise, he continued on Highland Road, and in front of Arlo Thompson's, he simply lowered the scraper of his tractor and scooped enough earth to make a bridge. The realization of how simple it was made me wish I had a big needle, because I knew where I would stick it. The kids and I went out and sat near the fence, watching the tractor clank its way around the field. The grass, waiting tall and attentive, fell over like obedient subjects at the arrival of the potentate. I breathed in the sweet scent. We had seen hay cut before, but never our hay. After several times around, Mr. Ming stopped near us and hopped off to fix a loose tooth on the cycle bar. While he worked, he explained the next steps in the haying process. The grass had to be raked into rows, and in a day or two it should be piled into shocks. That gave me an idea. Could the kids and I do it by hand? That way we can learn more about the process, I asked him. Mr. Ming looked surprised. Sure, that's how we used to do it. But nowadays, kids in this valley are capable of helping with the crops, but they're spoiled. They don't even like to pick strawberries. Sig looked sheepish. We ought to ship them off to boring, I said. Mr. Ming laughed and explained in detail. Don't roll it over while you rake. If you get it tangled, you'll have trouble taking it in. My big question was when? Mr. Ming looked at the sky, seeming to be measuring the clouds against the blue. It all depends on the weather. When the job was finished, Corey came out. They had barely nodded before they were comparing life stories. Surprisingly, both had come from Europe with their parents in 1917. The Mings from Switzerland, and Corey, of course, from Norway. Mr. Ming told of their reason for coming to America. I was 7 years old when I saw a big curl of black smoke and realized our barn was on fire. I watched my dad grabbing hold of the barn gate. It was blazing, and I was scared he'd burn up too. His hands were burnt bad, but the cows got out. But the best cow was on fire. All summer her back was one painful scab. Corey said, That's interesting. We had a barn fire too just before we came to America, and I watched my dad opening up the gates. Don't remember that his hands got burned, though. Did you get the cows out? Mr. Ming asked. Corey laughed. It wasn't cows. It was pigs. Yeah, they got out. All of them. And we chased 'em for days. Never caught many of them. My dad said they didn't get burned up in the barn. They got roasted in the neighbor's oven. They both laughed. Interesting. Why are there so many barn fires? I asked. Because of green hay stored in the barn. I began having nightmares about putting the hay in 1 minute too early. I could imagine all of Corey's equipment up in flames, and Saudi and Goaty and the chickens. Hopefully even Sick Chick. Mr. Ming had the remedy. Trust the Lord and check your insurance. 2 days of hard racking it took, and 2 for shocking, even with the help of neighbor kids who came out of curiosity and worked until they got bored. As I labored, a little inner voice kept saying, You've got 50 tons of hay to rack, 50 tons to shock, 50 tons to store, and you'll never get it done. And I believed it. On the 4th of July, Corey went out to the field and came back in and made the announcement, We'd better get in the hay. I looked out to the field. Do you think it's ready? It's ready to be taken in or rained on. I don't think so. I've been praying all week that the Lord would hold off the rain. Well, he's held it off all week, but today it's going to rain. We had planned to use dirt that Sig and I had removed from the barn cellar to fill in the worst erosion ruts, but with this new emergency upon us, we had to abandon that idea. Corey put sides on the trailer and sent us off for the first load, while he stayed to prepare the crib. I felt like a St. Bernard on a rescue mission. We loaded the trailer and got back in the truck. The grass was slick, and I had to give it plenty of gas to make it to the barn. We hardly got any hay in at all. Most of it lay along the field where it had bounced out. By the next trip, Freya's friends Judy and Marcia joined us. I told all 5 of the kids to lay on top of the hay to hold it in. I put the truck in gear, gave it the gas, and started up the hill. The kids began to scream. I slammed on the brakes. What's the matter? It tickles our tummies, I yelled. Well, don't scream. I think you're in trouble. As soon as Corey finished the crib, he came out to help. He picked up in 1 forkful what we had done in 10. On the way up the hill, the kids began to scream again. I've told them not to yell. Corey wasn't worried. That's kids. Let them have their fun. But we wouldn't know if there's an emergency, Corey shrugged. What kind of emergency could we possibly have? And so it went. On the last trip, I decided to have a ride in the trailer with the kids. Help me up, I called to Corey, but he was already starting the motor. Hey Sig, I need your... But he and Eric were scrambling up the other side. Freya, will you come? But the girls were engrossed in an important conversation. Boys. I hadn't quite reached the top when I heard Corey yell to Freya, Is everybody in? And I heard Freya answer absent-mindedly, Yep, go ahead. I was still teetering on my elbows with my legs still hanging over the sides. Hey, stop! I'm not in yet! But the exhaust gave a loud response and we were off. Sig saw my dilemma and caught hold of my arm, but he was not strong enough to pull me in. And then my stomach began doing loops. Every time we went over a bump, it felt like I was being shot up in a fast elevator. I began to laugh. Sig didn't think it was funny. "Mother, stop laughing, hang on." Both Sig and Eric began to yell, "Stop! Help!" Their frightened looks sent me into more fits of laughter. Somehow, I managed to hang on until we arrived at the barn. Corey turned off the motor and jumped out. "For crying out loud, what are you doing?" "I never got in." "Why didn't you yell?" It was almost dark when we finished up. The kids dashed off to go to the school grounds, where the fire department was scheduled to set off fireworks. Corey closed the huge doors that opened out to the backfield, and the interior of the barn became dark and quiet. We looked up, but we couldn't see the sky through the rafters anymore. But we could hear the raindrops on the roof. It was a special moment, a time of Thanksgiving. And then the fireworks began. "That's a good way to start a barn fire," Corey said.